Hey guys, it's Mr. Valley Doll. Hope everyone's doing okay out there. I'm going to be going through some of the key points in your Chapter 20 PowerPoint. A lot of this information you'll be using for a few of your assignments that will be posted on Google Classroom. So please try to follow along, and you can always go back to this video or the PowerPoint that will be posted on here for you to use for any assignments. I'll be putting directions up there for you as well. If you have any questions, you guys know you can always contact me. We'll go ahead and get started on the PowerPoint presentation. We'll try to keep it short and sweet, hit the major points. So for Chapter 20, one of the main things that we're going to be looking at is animal interactions, how they interact with each other, also how they interact with their environment. And some of these things we went through before we left for this kind of extended period that we're on right now. But we're going to go through this whole PowerPoint together and make sure that we understand some of these even simple interactions that we've talked about. First one, predation. Of course, you guys are familiar with, one animal eating another, like a lion, for example, eating a wildebeest. We can see in this picture down here. But it can be something as simple as maybe even a turtle eating plants. This is going to be where an individual of one species, which is going to be the predator, eats all or a part of an individual of another species, which will be the prey. Have a couple different types of predators. Carnivores, these are going to be types of predators that eat other animals. So in our picture down here of our lions eating this wildebeest down here, those would be considered, of course, a carnivore. Herbivores, example down here of your turtle, would be predators that are eating plants. All heterotrophs are either going to be predators or parasites or both. If you remember, a heterotroph is something that eats another organism. Could be another animal, could be another plant. We have some adaptations in animal prey that they can use to avoid being eaten. First obvious one is escape, being able to run away or hide from your predator that's trying to eat you. It's always a good idea. A lot of organisms have quick reaction times to get away from things that are trying to eat them. We can see in this picture up here this organism hiding behind some leaves. You can imagine something being chased by this cheetah like a gazelle, trying to run away from it so it avoids being food. Down here, another example, something like a hippo hiding out in kind of a swampy type area. Here we have an example of a frog that is camouflaged in with its surroundings, not going to be able to be seen very easily by any types of predators. Some organisms will produce toxins, like there are some frogs that are going to be poisonous. Some predators, some reptiles like snakes for example, they might actually produce venom so that they can stun or kill their prey. Also, we have an example here of mimicry, which is where organisms will try to fool their prey into thinking that they are something else. So we have one species closely resembling another species. Here we have an insect. The pattern on its wings on the back looks like it has these two large eyes. So if a predator was coming after it, they might be fooled for a quick second and say, "Whoa, that's not a beetle. That's something with a face with those two eyes right there." So they might not want to attack that right away because it looks kind of intimidating to them. There are two main types of mimicry. First type is going to be Batesian mimicry. This is going to be where a harmless species resembles a venomous species. And our example here that I have for you is this harmless king snake down here. This, even though it's harmless, it looks like it could be pretty dangerous because it has this red, yellow, and black coloration. It matches the colors that you would see on a lot of venomous coral snakes. Now, it's not the same pattern or anything, but if a bird or another organism came across this snake, it would see those colors and say, "Whoa, that might be something that I don't want to mess with. If I try to eat that, it might, bite me and actually kill me, and I might end up being the prey if I try to eat that snake." So that's Batesian mimicry. Harmless organism comes to resemble one that is harmful. We see that a lot in different types of reptiles and insects. Another type of mimicry is Müllerian mimicry, and that is where two or more dangerous or distasteful species look similar. And here we have an example of different types of bees and wasps. A lot of them have that black and yellow coloration. So that's something that a lot of organisms come to recognize. Oh, if I see an insect and it's black and yellow, there's a good chance that that thing's going to sting me. Of course, animals are going to try to avoid that. Not only is it painful, but it can actually be dangerous and in large numbers can cause death. So being able to mimic other things that are dangerous helps to make the entire species more intimidating, ensure that things aren't going to try to be eating these types of insects because they know if they try to eat them, they're going to end up getting stung. Let's look at some adaptations in plants. Plants, they can't get up and move out of the way, but they do have some physical defenses. Thorns, spines, sticky hairs, tough leaves, for example. In this picture up here, we got a plant with some thorns on it. I'm sure we've all run into different types of thorns in our life where, pretty painful, pretty tough to eat. A cactus is a good example as well. Not many things are going to be able to eat a cactus because of all the spines on it. Also, plants might have chemical defenses. They might be able to produce different types of secondary compounds, chemicals that are byproducts of the plant's metabolism and are harmful or distasteful to animals. So plants, they might be able to produce some chemicals that make them taste nasty or poisonous to organisms trying to eat them. So another defense that they can actually have to prevent them from being eaten so easily, even though they can't move out of the way. Also down here, example of a mushroom. There are different types of fungi, for example, like mushrooms, that can produce harmful chemicals that make organisms sick when they eat them. So those are all examples of secondary compounds, chemicals that prevent animals from eating different types of plants in our area. Competition is a very big part of animal interactions. Lots of things are always competing with each other. If you have interspecific competition, these are interactions between members of the same species competing for the same resources. So for example, see if you had members of the same bird species that were trying to compete for nesting sites. Some of them might be able to build nests faster than others. That would be an example of competition. There might only be so many places where this species of bird can build a nest, and the ones that can do it the fastest, collect the materials to build the nest the fastest, they're going to do better in that environment because now they're going to have a place to lay their eggs. While the other ones that were not able to do it that quickly, they might lose out because they won't be able to find good areas to lay their eggs. Interspecific competition. This is going to be a type of interaction in which two or more species use the same limited resources. So an example would be something like lions and hyenas, two different species. Oftentimes they're depending on some of the same organisms for their food. A lot of times hyenas kind of take they kind of back off a little bit, let the lion get the first take on that. But sometimes hyenas do get pretty hungry, and they might try to close in and chase the lion off if there's only one of them so they can get to the food. So that's going to be an example of interspecific competition, competition between two different species. Sometimes competitive exclusion can occur. This is where one species will be eliminated from a community because of competition for the same limited resources. So sometimes when competition gets too intense, let's say that the hyenas, they get really, really aggressive and there's just so many of them that they get to the food before the lion does and they chase the lion off somehow because there's so many hyenas, then the lions, they might have to leave that area to find a place where there aren't so many hyenas where they can get the food first and make sure they get enough food for their entire pride. So something we've talked about earlier this year is the idea of a niche. That's the role that a species plays in its environment. Sometimes due to competition, though, an organism's niche can get changed. The fundamental niche, that's the range of conditions that a species can potentially tolerate. So for example, in our picture down below, we have two different types of barnacles. The brown barnacle, its fundamental niche is all over that rock face. However, the blue one, it can only live down towards the bottom of that rock face, probably because it needs to be underwater more, it needs to be closer to the water. So that's the fundamental niche. The realized niche, that is going to be the part of the niche that the species actually uses. So in our picture below, we see that the brown barnacle, even though it could live all over that rock face, it can only actually, it's only actually living in the top part of that rock because the blue barnacle is kind of pushing it up out of the way. Because the blue barnacles, they can only live down towards the bottom. So the fundamental niche, sometimes it gets changed to a realized niche due to competition. Things fight for space. They can't grow where they normally would because something else is already growing there or growing there better. Competition can also cause something called character displacement to occur. This is the evolution of differences in a characteristic due to competition. One of the best examples that we've looked at this year of character displacement is Darwin's finches. We see in these pictures here all of the different finch species that exist today on the Galapagos Islands. When we look at the genetic evidence, it shows us that all of these different species were once one uh, finch species, all having the same type of beak. But due to different mutations that showed up, we got different beak types that showed up in these different birds. And some of those beak types were really good at getting other types of food. That's something that caused those beak types to stick around. Because if all of the birds had the same type of beak and they all ate the same type of food, maybe seeds for example, it's likely that those birds might run out of food. But if a different beak type shows up that allows one of those birds to maybe eat a different type of maybe insect or fruits, that helps to break up the resources that are being used. And we see that happen a lot with different characteristics like beak types. Having those different beak types show up allow for less competition, which is something that will allow for more birds overall to survive. Something else that we might see when competition is most intense in similar species is something called resource partitioning. This is where we break up a resource for organisms so that not every organism uses the entire part of that resource. So here an example, we have different species of birds, and let's say that they are having to live in the same type of tree. Even though they might live in the same type of tree, some of the birds, they might instinctually maybe only live in the top part of the tree and use the resources up on top, while another species of bird, they might only live in the bottom part of that tree and use that for their food and their nesting sites. So it helps to break up their resources, kind of like dividing up a pizza, making sure that everybody gets a slice. You know, the slice might not be exactly even, but every species is getting to use a piece of that resource. That's resource partitioning. That reduces competition and ensures survival among those similar species. Symbiosis refers to a close long-term relationship between two organisms. We can see in the pictures down below many different examples of symbiosis. If we look at the one with the orange clownfish, that example of symbiosis, you have the clownfish living in a sea anemone. They both depend on each other. The clownfish depends on the sea anemone for protection. It can swim along all those different tentacles, and those tentacles actually will sting other organisms that might try to eat the clownfish, but they don't sting the clownfish. The clownfish produces a special oil on its scales that allow it to swim between those tentacles without being stung, and the tentacles actually provide protection for that clownfish. On the other hand, the clownfish provides some food for the sea anemone. The clownfish, you know, it'll eat some small things, and it will go to the bathroom uh, in that sea anemone, and that sea anemone will use some of that waste from the clownfish as a food source. In a couple of our other examples, we see a bird and a cow working together there. The bird might be eating some of the insects and parasites that live on the cow, so the bird's getting food, the cow's getting clean. Some things might grow on trees, get a place to live on a tree. Um, they might depend on that. We see other examples here of a shark with some cleaner fish on it being cleaned by some fish, symbiotic relationship in that picture. And then also pollination, we'll talk a little bit more about here in just a moment. Pollination is a very important type of symbiosis in any ecosystem. There are three main types of symbiosis. The first one is parasitism, and it's not very nice. This is going to be where one individual is harmed while the other benefits. This does not result in the immediate death of the host, however. So here's an example of a tick living on a person's skin. Okay, this can be any organism up here, but we see it on a human in this example. This is one we're all familiar with. We've probably seen them on our pets, or maybe had them on us if we spend time outside. This is an example of a parasite that lives on the outside of its host. It's feeding on the blood, feeding on the nutrients in the blood. The tick doesn't want to kill the organism that it's on, then it would lose its food source. It wants to live on that organism as long as possible. So that's something we see with most parasites. Even though they are harmful in many cases, they usually are not going to try to kill the organism that they are living off of. So with parasitism, the host is going to be harmed, but usually not killed. The parasite will benefit from this relationship. So lots of different examples of parasitism. A simple one there with the tick. The tick is an example of an ectoparasite. This is a parasite that remains on the outside of the host. Right. Another example that we see here is a caterpillar with lots of little wasp babies living on it. Sometimes wasps actually will sting caterpillars and lay some of their eggs on it. This is an example you might not be familiar with. However, there are some videos about this that you could look up if you're interested. That's another example of a parasite. Endoparasites, these are going to be parasites that live inside of the host body. And here's an example of a tapeworm. This is one of the best examples of endoparasites. The tapeworms, they get inside of the organism by way of their eggs. The organism ingests the eggs of the tapeworm, usually on accident. And then the tapeworm lives inside of the intestines and hooks onto the intestines and then sucks the nutrients out of the organism. So once again, the host organism is the one being harmed. The host would be a human, for example. And the parasite, that's the one that's going to be benefiting. So the parasite in this case would be the tapeworm. Now, another type of symbiosis that is much nicer than parasitism is mutualism. And this is where two species actually benefit from each other. So both organisms get something good out of the relationship. Some of these relationships are so close that neither species could actually survive without each other. So an excellent example of this is pollination, which I'm circling in this picture down here. With pollination, we know that, for example, the pollinator, whatever insect it might be, gets food from the plant that it lands on, but it also gets pollen on it. And it will take that pollen to the next plant that it goes to, and that will help the plant actually reproduce with other plants in the area. So that's an example where both species are getting something good out of the relationship, and that's what we see there. Other examples that we see here, some ants will actually take care of caterpillars for a while. They can act as actually a food source for the caterpillars. Caterpillars can produce a type of almost like nectar that the ants will actually feed on as they're growing, and the ants will actually try to protect the caterpillar as other organisms try to eat it. Another type of symbiosis is called commensalism, and this is where one species benefits and the other is not affected. Some examples that we would see with this would be species that scavenge for leftover items. So birds are a great example of that. If, for example, they're walking next to a cow, like in our first picture shown here, the bird might be getting some of the insects that the cow's kind of disturbing and scaring. Um, the bird's getting a benefit from this, but it's not really hurting the cow by taking those insects because the cow's not really depending on the insects for its food, it's depending on the grass. Another example that we see might be with cleaner fish. They might attach on or swim near a big type of fish like a shark or a whale and get some of the food that the shark or the whale misses or that it chews up and kind of has some of the food run out of its gills or its mouth, doesn't eat it all. Some of those cleaner fish can get that. That's another example of commensalism. With species richness, this refers to the number of different species in a community. This varies or changes with latitude, which is distance from the equator. So in this picture, up towards the top here, the areas that are closer to where the equator is, usually those places have a higher number of different species. This is where we find your tropical rainforest type areas, places that have a lot of different species. As you get further away from the equator, however, the number of different species will usually drop off. So where we're located here in North America, we still have a decent number of different species, but not anything close to what you would find in the tropical areas. They have a much higher species richness than we do. So that's a pattern that we see with species richness on Earth. Species evenness, this refers to the relative abundance of each species. So we would look at an area sometimes to see if it has roughly an equal number of maybe bird species to um, insect species. That would show us if an area has species evenness or not. Some areas have more species evenness than others, depending on what the climate's like and what type of interactions happen with the organisms there. Species area effect. This shows that larger areas usually contain more species than smaller areas do. That tends to make sense. This is most often applied to things like islands, where area is actually limited by geography. So chances are if you run across two different islands and one island is significantly bigger than the other, then the bigger island is probably going to have a larger number of different species than the smaller island. That might not always be the case, but that tends to be a pattern that we see a lot in ecology. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about community stability and species richness. In any community, there's usually a type of disturbance that occurs. This is any event that will change communities, remove or destroy organisms, or alter how resources are available. A disturbance can be abiotic, that means it's caused by a non-living thing. For example, could be a drought, a fire, a flood, a volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, big storms. All of these can disturb a community and wipe out organisms, wipe out resources, and cause a change to happen in that community. It might not ever be the same again. So we had an example up here. Looks like we have maybe a big storm that moved through here that ripped up some of the trees in this area. Okay, changing the community, changing the resources. Now, disturbances can also be biotic, caused by living things. Examples could be elephants tearing up trees, prairie dogs moving soil, humans coming in, bulldozing, clear-cutting areas, building stores and parking lots in areas where organisms used to be. Those will be biotic disturbances caused by living things that actually change the community. Stability refers to the tendency of a community to maintain relatively constant conditions, a community's resistance to disturbances. Some areas are more stable than others, while other areas they might be able to change very quickly if some type of disturbance comes in. Now, we usually see a pattern of changes take place in most communities. This is referred to as ecological succession. This is the gradual, sequential regrowth of a community of species in an area. So let's say something really bad happens to a forest. Let's say that a forest fire rips through it and destroys everything, sort of like we've seen with the big forest fires recently. You're going to start out with mainly just bare soil, all the burnt remains of that ecosystem that was once there. But over time, we'll start to see it start to repair itself, start to come back. You start to get some small types of plants maybe show up first. And this can take years and years worth of time to see that change take place to where eventually we can get back to that original community or something similar to it. This might take, for example, 50 to 100, 200 years sometimes to get this forest to rebuild itself. But that pattern of regrowth is called ecological succession. Now, there are two main types of succession that we see. The first type is primary succession, and this is the development of a community in an area that has not supported life previously, such as bare rock, sand, an island formed by a volcanic eruption. So this happens where soil is not initially present. So where life has not existed yet before. So let's say that we get a new island formed by a volcano. We don't really have soil on it yet. We just have this volcanic rock. Eventually, that rock will get broken down. It might get some mosses and some lichens, which are fungi and algae that kind of live together. Might get some small organisms like that to start to break down those rocks. Eventually, it might form some soil where we get some very simple plants that will come about, like grasses and weeds. Eventually, you can get some bigger plants, different types of bushes and shrubs that can grow in that area once the soil becomes a little bit better. And then over a long period of time, you might eventually get bigger types of trees that could show up in that area and animals along with it all throughout. So that's primary succession. Happens in a place where life did not exist before. Secondary succession. This happens in an area where there was life before, but it had been disrupted by some type of natural disaster or human activity. So, for example, a fire or humans coming in and clear cutting an area, wiping out the community. Secondary succession would be the regrowth of that community after the disturbance took place. So you might get, in this case, some annual plants start to show up because there's still soil there, so we don't have to start all the way over. We still have soil that we can use. So you get plants showing up earlier in this case because they already have soil and nutrients. And then once again, same type of pattern, smaller plants first, shrubs, bushes, then eventually bigger trees if we're looking at a forest type area. A pioneer species, this is a species of organisms that show up a lot or predominate early in succession. So these tend to be very, very small species. They grow quickly and they reproduce quickly. So different types, we see this a lot around here with different types of weeds growing up through sidewalks and pavement. Algae, mosses that can grow on rocks, things that can grow quickly that are very small. Those are usually your pioneer species. Okay, they grow over things. They can grow sometimes where there's not a lot of soil, like something like a lichen, which is going to be an algae and a fungus that kind of live together. They can grow in places where there's not really soil, so they often are a good pioneer species. The climax community. This is going to be the final stage of succession. So this is the community that proceeds through a predictable series of stages until it reaches the stable endpoint. So for example, we might have a forest that's been wiped out by a fire, but eventually you give it enough time, it will go through changes and become that forest again in that area. So that climax community, that forest, where you have the big trees and all the organisms, that would be the climax community that's going to be stable until some type of big disturbance happens again. Maybe a forest fire, volcanic eruption, something like that. So that wraps up our discussion of animal interactions and how ecosystems change over time. Feel free to go through this video, look at different parts that you need to review to help you out. The PowerPoint's going to be on there as well, so you can, go through the slides without, having to hear me talk about them again. You don't have to take the whole half hour and go through it again. You can use those slides. Okay?